suit on this morning. We'll talk about banking and money. It has to be treated with a great deal of respect. John Kenneth Galbraith, an outstanding institutional economist, wrote a book called Money, Whence It Came and Where It Goes, or something like that title. I recommend it if you want to get some perspective on the history of money. I think it's one of his finest works. Anyway, he makes the observation in that book that the surest way for an economist to ruin their reputation is to say something a little out of the ordinary about money. What the heck? Everything to lose. Here it goes. I think it's the responsibility of scholars to not only help people understand the impact, as we've studied, of institutional alternatives and their change through time, but to be part of the change process, to present new ideas which people can consider, add to supply of new ideas. And I believe at this juncture, maybe it's always true, that we're desperately in need of new ideas. The alternatives that seem to be before us are just not rich enough, not enough variety there. So there's sort of this expression that is widespread. Apparently it started with Margaret Thatcher, called "There is no alternative," T-I-N-A. I don't believe that. There are alternatives to the world systems, economic systems we now have it. But we can also use some more ideas. Okay, I'm going to start with an observation of the world. And I just ask you if this fits your observation of the world. The slide that I have. The great puzzle. We have people. They're not all employed. We have natural resources. Yeah, some of them are getting more scarce, but we have natural resources. A lot of countries are resource rich. But we don't get them together. I just use houses here as one metaphor for production. Labor plus resources equals some output. And it strikes me that there are opportunities for using these more fully than we do at the moment. Both in the United States, the Western world, the whole world. What's your observation? Am I starting where you would start? Do we have any unemployment around the world? Underemployment? Do we know how to do things? We have knowledge. Some can always use more, but we know different production functions that we're not using. So what are the institutional alternatives for putting these things together? Realizing opportunities which are there and not now being realized. Well, the most obvious one, the simple-minded one, is command and threat. That's what I call the big stick. You know, if I come with a big stick and you're asleep under the tree, industrial plant not being used, resources not being used, particularly not being used, I come with my stick and I say, how about if we build a house today? Well, crude, maybe you don't have all the tools you'd like to have, but probably something. That would work. And actually, if you look around the world, we have what's called warlords, and they're pretty close to that. They come with a Kalashnikov instead of a stick, and they say, well, today we're going to plant poppies and harvest them, and it gets done. And it's one way to organize the world. Command system. Steps. Somebody comes up with a physical stick for beating, not a total symbolic stick. People know the meaning of it and respond to it, and they say, okay, today we're going to build houses. That would work. Well, what's the modern way we do this? in markets, where we hire labor and other resources. What's the equivalent of a person with a big stick or a totem? Entrepreneurs. They're the big chiefs. How do they get their symbols of authority? Why does anybody pay attention to it? You don't pay attention because they're going to whack you in the head. You don't pay attention because they promise you eternal damnation. You pay attention because they have dollars. Well, then the question is, where do they get them? And here I want to build on our institutional economics thinking. To look at opportunity sets, how they're distributed, what are the rules that create those opportunity sets and distribute them. In short, a property rights view of money capital formation. Now just repeating my little stick symbols here. Got people not being used. I've got an access time. This is capital goods. Tools. Plus natural resources gives you useful products. Like that. That's the physical reality. And remember I make the distinction between production functions, which are in physical terms, input-output, and the symbolic systems, the institutional systems that organize people to use those resources. It says who's entitled to use them. What else can you do? So on the other hand, you have a symbolic system made up of property rights. And instead of physical capital, goods, we have financial capital. And I know it's confusing in general discussion, we just talk about capital. Capital goods are one thing, that's the physics part of it, the biology part of it. And the financial capital are the symbols, roughly equivalent to totem poles. So I want to think about banking as property rights. We've emphasized incompatible use goods. The question is, who's the factor owner? That's an interesting case of incompatible use goods. Many of them are not. Here's one example, I believe. Who owns? Who's the entrepreneur? Just to repeat again, we have the stick approach. We have state-owned firms. This was supposedly the essence of communism in Soviet Russia. State-owned firms. We have a plan. We're going to do things. Show up. They did give them wages, but the ideas came from the state and the center. Totems, I've already discussed. Dollars. How do people get dollars? Okay. This is the key to it. The way dollars are generated, as you know, and I'm going to be very basic here. Hope I'm not insulting you. You already studied money and banking, but I want to look at it maybe a little differently. But this part is straightforward, and I think non-controversial. Loans to private individuals create money. When a bank gives a loan and writes a number after the firm's name, they've created money. They can do the same thing for private entrepreneurs, would-be private entrepreneurs, and public entrepreneurs. And I want to talk about the possibility of zero interest public debt when the government is the borrower. I'll raise the question of why do they pay interest on their borrowings? All of these structures select who is the entrepreneur. Now again, some basic facts, it's controversial. When you have full employment, when you've used your resources to their max, then all you can do is reallocate. You know, if the market is telling you that some products now are more desired by consumers, that may be a signal for an entrepreneur to expand production in that area, and you move money from one area to another, from less demand to higher demand. In that context, saving is the only way to get a new product. But when you do not have full employment, which is my observation of the world, we're not there. We're not anywhere close to full employment. Whether we're talking about the United States or India or Ethiopia or whatever, we're not there. If you think we are there, and the unemployed people prefer leisure to work, then you can leave now, because what I'm going to say after this will not be of interest to you. I do not believe we're in that kind of equilibrium. The key point here is saving is not necessary. You create new symbols so people can use unused resources. That's the institutional task. And I want to say, by sort of background, again, it appears to me an observation that the problem of poverty is not a supply problem. It's not a how do you produce it. It's not what we used to call the niggardliness of nature. Nature being a hard nut to crack. You just can't get any more out of it. We could get out of it. The problem is not a supply side. It's on the demand side. We don't have people with effective purchasing power to call forth physical supply as possible. All right, then where does money come into this? I have some definitions. You have it also on the handout I gave you for these. That's the point. Money is a symbol for what is and what could be. That's critical. Both a symbol for what is, the things that we've already produced, helps us trade them, but it's also a symbol for what could be, that unrealized potential that I'm talking about. Definition of money creation is already suggested. When the banks write a number after the borrower's name, money is created. It's an electrical, in modern terms, it's an electrical charge, isn't it? Some electronic device that records this. You don't even have to write anything down in it. Remind yourselves that all money is debt. This stuff that you and I spend daily. What does it say? Federal Reserve note. This is legal tender. Yeah, it's the debt of the United States government, and wherever you're from, it's the same thing in your country. All money is debt, there is no other kind. What's a banker? Now here comes the institutional understanding from our perspective. A banker is a creator of property rights. That's what they do. When they make loans, they create property rights in undesignated resources. In the context of unused resources, they're the seller. We always ask this question, who's the buyer, who's the seller? Banks are sellers. They're given the right to sell. Access to unused resources. Banks create symbols. Just like more primitive economies created totem poles. It's the same process. Nothing essentially different about it. Creates new symbols so new entrepreneurs can command resources which otherwise would not be used. What's a central bank? Well, they're the big bank. They're the regulator. They're regulating the banks. So in fact, they're the source of this right to create money. And they regulate the amount. It's a big deal. They also set the standards for what's a good portfolio. In other words, they look at the loan assets of a bank and say, yeah, you've made, these are the kind of things that are collateral. You're either playing by the rules or you're in danger of going bankrupt. Banks go bankrupt. Anyway, the point is that both banks and central banks create rights in the same way that a legislature does or a court does. This may be an unusual way of looking at what banks do, but that's essentially it. Does that make sense? Banks are like a legislature. They create rights. Well, here are the familiar T accounts that you're probably familiar with if you study money banking. To a bank, when somebody makes a deposit, from the bank's point of view, that's a liability because it's owned by somebody else and they have to pay it out in the bank. Of course, when they put that money into their vault, that's an asset. That cash is an asset. Now we come to the fun part of creating money. The rules in general say, as a function of your assets, you may create new loans. And that's a variable that the central bank can manipulate, among other things, to affect the loan capacity of the bank. So Celia comes in and would like a loan. If the reserve ratio is that I've suggested here, then the bank can make an $80 loan, or $80 million, or whatever. That's big time, okay? $80 million. See, it's got some really great ideas here. All right, now the liabilities of the bank have gone from 100 to 180 when you add in. C has now got an account at the bank, right, with $80 in it. Created by hitting a button on the electronic device. Writing numbers after people's names. Nigel, would you like me to write some numbers after your name? If I was a bank, I would do it. Particularly for you. No, there's no printing press. There's no gold. All those things are just part of the ceremony. Big time money is not this stuff we have in our pocket. It's the money written after firms' names that constitute the financial capital of any country. Now, let me just work through. We have unemployed resources. The central bank has got to make a decision. It's very important. They have to have an understanding of what the potential capacity of the economy is. When you have 10% unemployment or whatever it is, or higher, well, it's pretty clear that you're not using all the resources. So I'm just going to use a humble example here. Let's say you have $400, $400 million, whatever you want to make it, of potential goods. The central bank estimates to be possible to produce but are not now being produced. There's unused resources. What are the alternatives? One is a tax. We tax one person, Charles in my example here, in order to put the city to work. Well, I guess that's kind of a sharing of the wealth. The city's now got a job. But total consumption is the same as it was before. It's just that Charles consumes a little less because he pays the tax. Celia consumes more because she's the recipient of the grant. Same GNP. We don't realize the potential. Alternatively, and here's a basic Keynesian idea. When you have unused resources and you have discouraged entrepreneurs, nobody comes forward to say, I've got a new idea, I want to build a factory, I want to do whatever, give me a loan and I'll put these resources to work. When the private entrepreneurs are discouraged, they do not use the full potential of the economy. Okay? We have what you might call an equilibrium and less than full employment. This was a basic notion of Keynes. And as you know, this is still controversial. Ever since Keynes and President Roosevelt in the United States used deficit financing to use the unused resources, as a reaction to that, people have been criticizing it ever since, and they're still criticizing it. So this is probably thousands of pretty agreed on the concept. The people that are affected are not agreed, and we're still arguing about deficit finance and its role in the economy. But anyway, I want to just make one aside here. The other clipping that I gave you about business firms being holders of great amounts of cash is pretty much the situation today. Corporation profits are high and have recovered from years ago when we were really in a recession. Okay? They've been making money. Are they hiring new employees? Are they building new factories? No. What are they doing with money? Much of it is they're buying each other, leading to larger consolidated firms. And two, they buy their own stock. I said to tell you something about what probably the general effect of tax policy is. We have reduced taxes with the story that this would make firms more profitable. When they were more profitable, they would invest and hire more people. That's the story. That's the standard story. Apparently, empirically, it's not true. Oh, it's not completely false. But it's not doing the job. We're not going to get there with tax policy. Thank you very much. If you lower my taxes and I'm in business, I'll stick the money in my pocket or whatever. I'm not going to build a new factory. In fact, I'm closing factories, right? General Motors is going to lay off 30,000 people next year and close factories. So is Ford. All right. When private entrepreneurs are discouraged and not willing to go to the bank and ask for a loan, then the Keynesian idea was government should do this. Government should get the loan, put people to work, get out of the recession, get back up to full employment, and then again release those resources to the private sector. By the way, all of us are beneficiaries of this idea here on the campus of Michigan State. I don't know if you are cognizant of this. The old auditorium building, you know what I was referring to? That is the so-called WPA project, Works Progress Administration. It was built during the Great Depression with government borrowing, putting construction workers to work rather than just sitting around. Which would you rather have? The MSU auditorium building or nothing? Leadership at that time said, no, we just have some auditoriums and park improvements. A lot of improvements in natural resources were made during this time. By the way, if you go in the auditorium, the entranceway, look up. You'll see a very nice mural. Artists were literally starving also. Non-construction workers didn't have any purpose for artists. So they paid artists to beautify our environment. There are other examples around campus. If you go to the Kresge Museum webpage, I think they have a menu item of all the art and buildings that were built during that period of the Great Depression. And this is the way it was done. We created new money, loans to individuals, but that wasn't enough to use all the resources. So government took loans, wound up then with an obligation, not only to repay the loan, but to pay interest on that borrowing. And as you know, the interest payments on the federal debt are the second largest budgetary expenditure of the federal government, just after national defense. It's huge. So a lot of your tax money just goes to pay interest on previous borrowings to get the economy going. Seems strange to me, but there you go. What's the alternative? Here's the new institution. I think everything that I've said up to now, everything I've said up to now is relatively non-controversial. How the banks work, the economists will tell you. Excuse me. As an alternative to borrowing, to public borrowing from banks and individuals, the Federal Reserve Bank could be the bank of the government. It is, but we don't use it for it. The Treasury could write checks on the Federal Reserve Bank, which is what they do. All the government expenditures are Treasury checks. Those checks can be drawn on they are drawn on the Federal Reserve. But now we pretend that that's a limited resource, and we're hesitant to have the government put all the resources that are unused to work. That's where we are. My question is, why? Why do we do this? It's a ceremonial observance, not unlike ceremonies that we think are fun and quaint in more primitive societies. Same. Anyway, here's the proposition. An economy does not have to save to realize increased output. Increased sources are unemployed. That's basic. Put it in opportunity cost terms, the opportunity cost of using an unused resource is zero. You don't give up anything, you just get something. So, an economy does not have to tax those with income to put those without income to work and to have income and products. Money is a right to command resources. What an entrepreneur does when they go to the bank. Handed the equivalent of the totem pole. Money is more easily used. It's efficient. Money is an electrical charge on a computer. It's cheap to make. When somebody does a type of service, of course you need to pay. When a bank evaluates a loan request from a private entrepreneur, they have to make a judgment as to whether that can be repaid or not. Is that a good idea? Will it produce new products or not? It's very important. So you want the banks to be rewarded for making good judgments. In fact, you also want them penalized when they make bad decisions. And by the way, I learned something a few years ago. I've told you a number of times, the problem with being an institutional economist is you have to know a lot of institutional detail. Now here's one that I didn't know until a few years ago. When a bank makes a bad loan and becomes non-performing, by convention, by law, that is a charge against the bank's capital. So to start a bank, you have to put a certain amount of money down. That's why I'm not a banker, otherwise I would make you a loan. But I have to have a whole lot of money to get started. Well, if I make a bad loan, that's a charge against my capital. If I get too many of them, I don't have any capital left. But there's nothing physical involved in that. That's a convention. I wish I knew more about Japan. Gone through 10 more years of recession. Put their interest rate to nearly zero.
Yes.
Still couldn't get people to build new equipment and hire people. That tells you something about the ultimate limit on monetary policy. Keep lowering the ideas. Of course, you lower the cost of something until you use more of it. That's the basic idea of economics. It's the basic idea. Well, the Japanese ran up to a situation where they kept lowering the cost of money, and people still didn't want it. And they had banks with huge amounts of non-performing loans. By any sort of general rule of financial quality, those banks should have been abolished. But it would have thrown the economy into even more turmoil, so the central bank of Japan said, we'll forget it. I know you got half your assets are not performing, we'll just ignore it. They do what they want to. That's a good idea. They abolished those banks. The economists even be in great position yesterday. Anyway, how about when the government comes and wants a loan? This is a no-brainer. Do I have to evaluate the government's probability that they're going to repay? It's irrelevant. So why should I pay a bank a big fee like I would if it was a private borrower to evaluate the proposed loan when it's to the government, and there's no question they're going to pay it back. There's nothing to be decided. So why pay them? Now this is the key property rights proposition. If Congress can give banks the right to create money, they surely can give themselves the right to create money. Just they have their own bank. And they do that, of course. That green stuff that I just showed you, it's in your pockets. It's debt of the U.S. government. It does not carry interest. All that currency, coin and cash, is non-interest bearing federal debt. Why don't they make more of it? My last proposition, paying banks to create money is a giant welfare program for banks. It's not just poor people that are on the dole. Banks. Often talk about living beyond our means. I was visiting with Bandana and observed unemployment in India. They have some modest programs of the government to put these people to work. They're building highways. See, there's a big expansion of highways in India, financed by taxes or government borrowing. You say, well, there's not enough money.